All right. So you must be wondering why I gave you a Nautilus shell for your birthday. And the reason is kind of complicated. We have to go back about 4 billion years to a time when there was no life on Earth. And when life first began on Earth, it was all like blue-green algae, not very exciting stuff, but critical. Because for 3 billion years, all of the life on this planet was algae, and what it did was it converted the CO2 into oxygen. Eventually that oxygen permeates the oceans, and the oceans become oxygenated. So, it's thanks to the blue-green algae that, any of this is happening. But then evolution kind of gets kick-started, in evolutionary terms. It's actually pretty quick. So for the first 3 billion years, blue-green algae, for the first 3 billion years, right? And that's all there was, up until about 1,200 million years ago. Life finally starts to get multicellular. And when I say multicellular, I mean it's pretty simple stuff. Here, what you basically have are a bunch of cells, right? And they join together. They all have a, commonality of some sort. And in the inside you have some enzymes of some sort like that, that helps them digest things, right? But it's just a simple wall, right? And things permeate through some sort of osmosis or whatever, just basic chemicals and amino acids and stuff permeate this barrier and are digested by these cells and are turned into food for all of these cells. Now, how do you get around? Well, eventually these things started developing little flagellate sort of things on them, or they teamed up with another cell that had a flagellate or something on them, and then that's what propels them through the water. Maybe 500 million years later, you end up with something like this, which is, relatively speaking, pretty complicated. But now you got an opening, right, and an exit, and you've got the same sort of enzymes that are breaking down food. The food's gotten a little bigger and probably a little trickier to catch because this thing, right, is eating stuff like this thing. And this thing has now developed simple tentacles and stuff to help it kind of grapple, and pull stuff like this into it. And this stuff breaks it down, and the flagellates are still helping it move. Now this is the really important part. See this stuff? And that? Those are photosensitive patches. They're not eyes, they're just photosensitive patches. And all it does is it helps this organism orient itself in the water so it knows basically which way is up. Up is bright, down is dark, and that's really all it can do. But, and this is where very interesting things start to happen. Now for the first 500 to 540 million years ago, we basically got worms, and they belong to 3 phylum. Now a worm sounds really complicated, but it's really not. It's the same thing, except now the cells have formed a wall like this, on 2 like this, right? This is a cutaway, this is looking straight through it. So it's the same sort of thing. You see these multicellular organisms combine together to make tissue, and you get a wall, and then you get some little stuff on the end, some tentacle-like stuff to help it force food, down this end, and then you got your, excretion point. And then this end starts to get a little more clever, right? It starts getting, bundles of neurons and stuff together like that to help it, locomote and move through the water and stuff. But it's basically still the same thing. It's just a tube, right? And again, it's also got the light-sensitive patches on it, so it knows, which way is up and which way is down. But it still can't see. It's very important. It has no vision yet, no vision at all. And then, so 800 to 540 million years ago, we've got worms, and we got 3 phylum of them, right? Now the difference between them is pretty academic. It's pretty hard to tell the difference between the phylum just by looking at them, because they all basically look like worms. But they're basically, the hollow tube with some nerve endings on one end, and photosensitive patches, to help it navigate itself through the water. Now, this is when a real mystery occurs. And this is when our friend the Nautilus finally starts to make an appearance. Well, it's going to be another 40 million years or so, but that's a blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. The Precambrian explosion happened at 544 million years ago to 538 million years ago. The Precambrian explosion. It only lasted 7 million years. right? Now, note, watch this. Before the Precambrian explosion, we had about 1,200 million years of life on Earth, and all of that evolution resulted only in 3 phylum, right? Now suddenly, in a 7 million year span of time, no time at all, we've got 38 phylum. What the hell happened? Suddenly, everything is really differentiated. Things have legs, shells, jaws, teeth, claws, fins, scales, but none of that stuff would have happened if something else hadn't happened first, and this is the game changer. All right, you got your photosensitive patch. We've already been through this. You get your photosensitive patch, like the multicellular organisms have, and it can basically tell which way is up, you know, but that's about it, you know, light and dark, really basic stuff. Up here, you have, a little bit later on in the game, this photosensitive patch of cells moves down into a little depression, all right? So now it's starting to detect light from a direction. Barely, it's still not vision. Again, a little later you have a cup eye, and now you have the cells way down here, and now the light rays are really only coming from this direction right here. And again, it's not what you and I would call a picture, but you know, it can tell when light is bouncing off of something, perhaps, like this, and it can tell that there's light in this direction, and there's light in this direction, and there's light in that direction, but it still can't make out an image. Now, this just closes up at the top, and you finally get the pinhole camera eye. And it's just you know, basically this again, except now it's starting to close in at the top. And as you know from making a pinhole camera, maybe at some time in science class or knowing anything about photography, light is now being focused to this little hole right here. And that's focusing it. Not very well, but it's focusing it. It's blurred images. And then certain animals like the Nautilus develop musculature right around this opening right here to expand and contract this opening. Now, the results of this are huge because suddenly everything can see, right? Before the eye, everything was kind of floating around in the ocean, just kind of running into each other. Like you didn't know if you had found food until you ran into it. You didn't know if you were about to be eaten until it sank its teeth into you. Actually, there were no teeth yet, but you know, until something started to gum you, you didn't know that there was anything sneaking up on you. So, the eye changes everything. Suddenly things are happening at a distance, and things have to start getting really, really clever about how they're going to find food and how they're going to get away from food. So, there you have it. After the eyes developed, suddenly everything goes from a worm to everything that we see today. Things with legs, shells, jaws, teeth, claws, fins, scales, different ways to find food and to get away from food. Shells to protect yourself from things that are trying to eat you, etc., etc. And none of this would have happened without the eye. So, among this 38 new phylum are the mollusks. They're one of the new phylum that's created during the Precambrian explosion, and to this day, mollusks represent the widest range of eye types of any other phylum. For example, they contain everything from, you know, all of these types right here that we just went through, patches, cup eyes, pinhole eyes, to complex eyes, including the squid, which is also a mollusk and has the largest complex eye of any animal in the history of the Earth. Now, a complex eye like ours is, you know, you can see that it's not much different than a pinhole camera, except now there's a clear coating and there's a lens back here that focuses the light, but it's the same thing. You know, and this little doodad here, the iris that opens and closes to control the amount of light, is something that the Nautilus has. But the interesting thing about the Nautilus eye, there's no covering here. That means it's open to the seawater. So the Nautilus's eye is just filled with seawater. This lens is an incredibly important adaptation. If the Nautilus simply had a lens over the exact same eye that it has with the same retinal patch in the very back of the eye, same everything else, just put a lens on top of it, the Nautilus's eye would become 400 times as sensitive to light, and it would have 100 times the resolution that it does. So can't underestimate the importance of an eye, and filtered viscera, liquid, to keep it you know, open and keep it from collapsing in on itself. So the Nautilus formed its eye sometime during the Precambrian explosion, which made it very successful. It was a good eye for the time, but something else made it very successful, something else that not all other animals had. One of these. This hard shell lets you know that there was something in the water that was trying to eat it. And the fact that there was something trying to eat it tells you that there was stuff swimming in the water, predators with eyes. But the shell helped it survive in other ways as well. And the Nautilus has a few tricks with this shell. They're all very interesting and all why it survived virtually unchanged for about 500 million years. Now the first trick is that the Nautilus was one of the first, I guess you could say one of the first upwardly mobile creatures. Now this shell serves as protection in two ways. One, it's hard for things to bite through it, but second of all, it allows it to descend to depths where the predators can't follow it. And the way it does that is really unique. Now, first of all, as you go lower in the water column, the more oxygen depleted the water becomes, and a lot of stuff can't survive down there. Now, the Nautilus responds by slowing down its metabolic activity, so it doesn't need as much oxygen. But the other trick is that it uses its shell like a scuba tank. It actually carries air inside the chambers in its shell, and it can sort of eke out just a little extra oxygen at depths that most other creatures can't. Now, its adaptability in different oxygen environments is what allowed it to survive the Permian extinction, which happened about 250 million years ago. Permian extinction was an event in which there was a lot of volcanic activity simultaneous with a lot of decaying vegetable matter on all the shorelines because the water levels had dropped. And there was this huge decaying event on a huge scale, and it just filled the entire atmosphere with CO2, huge greenhouse effect. 90% of all life on Earth vanished. And it was because most things just suffocated, including the trilobites, which had been, up until then, one of the most successful and most abundant creatures on the planet. But they all live on the bottom of the ocean, kind of crawling around and stuff, and there's no air down there. They all suffocated and died. The Nautilus had the ability to go up to more oxygen-rich waters and breathe. Now, this trick is one of the reasons why it was able to cross over the Permian extinction period, and why it's one of the few animals to do so. Very lucky in that regard, very well designed, and it is why this animal hasn't changed much in about 500 million years. Now, its shell also makes it an excellent fisherman. It's able to pursue its food source, plankton, better than any other animal that feeds on plankton, because plankton goes up at night and down very deep during the day. And most animals feed on plankton either at the surface or in the middle or on the bottom, depending on which pressure they can handle. But the Nautilus can follow its food source all the way up and down the water column, all the way down to 800 meters, which is kind of crazy. And at 800 meters, its shell will implode, and any Nautilus that goes that deep doesn't go on to reproduce, so they don't go deeper than 800 meters. Now, the way that it does this ascending and descending thing, it does it the exact same way that a submarine does it. It's got these chambers called camera separated by septum, like this, these chambers right here. It is, after all, called the chambered Nautilus. And through these septum is the siphuncle, which is a piece of tissue that's part of the soft tissue of the Nautilus. And through osmosis, through controlling the salt in the amount of salt in its blood, it actually controls the amount of gas versus liquid inside these chambers. And that is what allows it to rise up and down in the water column in the exact same way modern submarines do, by controlling its buoyancy. Now, the shape of the shell is really significant and very beautiful, and it's really appealed to the human imagination for thousands and thousands of years. When the Egyptians found these things, the fossilized versions of these things, their predecessors, the Ammonites, they thought that looked like a ram's horn, and their god was called Ammon, and Ammon had ram's horns. So ever since then, scientists have referred to the predecessors of these things as Ammonites. But the Egyptians were certainly not the last people to find this shape compelling. It's also inspired architecture. It has inspired art, and even industrial design. And there's a really interesting reason why this shape is so appealing. It's appealing thanks to the fact that it is a perfect logarithmic spiral. And what is a logarithmic spiral? Well, the logarithmic sequence, in this case the Fibonacci series, and Fibonacci was the most famous, most brilliant mathematician of the 13th century, and he came up with this series of numbers, and these are the Fibonacci numbers, and they occur over and over again in nature, but it works like this. You take 1 and 1, add them together, and you get 2. You put 1 and 2 together, and you get 3. You put 2 and 3 together, and you get 5. You put 3 and 5 together, and you get 8, and 13, and so on and so on. Now, it just so happens that you can do the same thing geometrically, and you end up with a Fibonacci geometric spiral. And you do it like this. You take a square, a value of 1 on each side, you add another one to it right here. Right? Now you take those two together, and you add them together, and you get 2. So this is a length of 2. And this side now is a length of 3. Now you got a square. That's 3 on each side. You add 2 and 3 together, and you get a square that is 5 on each side. And now this length is 3, that's 5. You add 5 and 3 together, and you get a square that is 8 on each side. And now you add the 8 and the 5 together, and you have a square that is 13 on each side. And now you will see that if you take a spiral, there it is. Fits perfectly, just as it should. And just in case you think I'm fudging the numbers, this is an actual Nautilus shell, right? Traced from a photograph. And this is a logarithmic spiral generated by a computer. And as you know, there's all kinds of geometric proportions in nature that we're supposed to find subconsciously very beautiful, the golden rule of the golden thirds, etc., dividing the face up into certain ratios, and you find the same ratios amongst all very, very beautiful people. So there you have it. Beautiful, ancient, enduring, a living fossil. Look upon it and reconnect to your 500 million year old past.